You're ready to roll.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We threw this together really fast, but we think it's really important that we're all talking about what needs to be done right now, not only because this is the biggest crisis in over 100 years in our country, but because there has been a reckoning coming for a long time about how our democracy is actually working for the people. And we have real serious problems to solve, starting with this pandemic, but many more to come. So we thought we'd have a little discussion tonight about the economic and moral case for the people. My name is Sara Nelson. I'm the president of the Association of Flight Attendants, represent 50,000 flight attendants at 17 different airlines. Half of them are on furlough or without a paycheck and without healthcare right now. So we're fighting for relief for the people that I directly represent. The other half may be flying over us right now, raining down solidarity on this discussion. So kudos to all the flight attendants out there. But I'm super excited about who all is here to have a little discussion tonight, starting with Reverend Delman Coates, who is the senior pastor at Mount Ennon Baptist Church in Clinton, Maryland, my neighbor. And he's the founder of the New Abolitionist Campaign, founder and president of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality, the BCC, and founder of Our Money Campaign, a movement to assert our public say over money creation by promoting reforms that ensure the money is created in ways that are more aligned with the public interests. My kind of guy. Darrick Hamilton. Welcome, Reverend Coates. Darrick Hamilton is Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race Stratification and Political Economy at the New School. And he's been instrumental in creating bold policy ideas like baby bonds and arguing with me and Stephanie Kelton for a federal jobs guarantee. Darrick, Stephanie, and I did join together on the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force for the Economy, and Stephanie Kelton is the now New York Times best-selling author of The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. I just want to say that I have a first edition classic without the New York Times best-selling note on it. And Stephanie has also served as chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee for the Democrats in 2015, and as a senior economic advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2016 and 2020 campaigns, as well as teaching at multiple universities around the world, currently at Stony Brook, and formerly chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And finally, we have Ryan Goldstone. And he's a national fellow at New America. His book on housing insecurity was already well underway when the pandemic hit. And now that the economic crisis has added jet fuel, sorry for the pun, everybody, to the housing insecurity, he's been working on his book and reporting from the ground in Atlanta about the extreme crisis facing millions of Americans, and has stories to tell us from right on the ground in America, these stories from real people that's threatening our entire economy. So we want to get to it and talk about relief for the people. And I thought that it's really important that we start to think about our demands, because we're looking right now at a Congress that has been unable to get relief to the American people. We should have had a second round of relief in place in August. That didn't happen. We had unemployment that was covering people's pay and stimulus checks that was helping people get through this crisis all come to an end. At the end of this month, we've got 30 to 40 million people who are in jeopardy of losing their homes, being evicted, 17 million children who are going hungry right now, 12 million people who are in jeopardy of losing any access to unemployment. And the list goes on and on. So we're in a dire situation here, and we still don't have relief from Congress. And now this week, we're looking at a severely slimmed down bill that our union would say we got to get locked in. But we would all say right now tonight that that is just simply not enough. So how are we going to fix this going forward? Because even if we lock in what we can now to make sure we don't completely fall off of a cliff, how can we fix this going forward? And a lot of people are looking at Georgia and saying that that's the only solution, that this election for those 2 Senate seats, the only solution. But the truth is that our politics have been failing us for a long time and not really working for the general welfare of the people. So we've got to have clear demands to fix our problems. And a lot of people are starting to understand, and thanks to people like Stephanie Kelton, who are bringing these ideas out into the open, that we need to get rid of things like PAYGO. And so I thought that we should probably start with defining what is PAYGO and why is it a problem? And Stephanie, with your experience working with the US Senate Budget Committee, can you give a quick review of what PAYGO is and maybe an example of why something that might have, you know, a well over a majority or a veto-proof majority of support in Congress for a specific idea, like, you know, making sure that kids have nutritious lunches, but it can't get passed. So could you give us a quick review?
Sure. Well, I want to start by saying thank you to everyone and to Sara for helping to put this together. As she said, this really did come up, I think, sometime Sunday night late. We had this idea, and all of a sudden, you know, here we are on Monday, and we can just make things happen. So thanks to all of you for making your schedules accommodate this. It's really nice. And as she said, it feels a little like getting the band back together. And so, look, PAYGO is a self-imposed, and that's really important, right? Because this is Congress saying, we're going to play by this rule called PAYGO, pay as you go. And what it essentially says is anytime we want to commit $1 of, say, new spending to education, infrastructure, feeding hungry kids, whatever it is, if we want to commit $1 of new spending, we have to find the money. We have to pay for that spending in one of 2 ways. Either we raise new revenue, so we try to convince enough other members of Congress to vote for some tax increase that will generate the revenue to quote unquote pay for that spending, or we fight over carving out money from some other area of the budget. So I say, well, I'll take the money out of defense, or I'll take the money out of, you know, this or that place, and that will pay for it. And the whole point is to avoid adding to the deficit, because Congress has for a very long time, at least theoretically, right, at least rhetorically, had this idea that adding to the deficit is something we just don't want to do. So in order to budget responsibly, we are going to hold ourselves to this standard called PAYGO, so that anytime we spend another dollar, we aren't adding to the deficit. Well, of course, we're adding to the deficit in big ways now, right? We did that with the CARES Act. That was a $2.2 trillion piece of legislation that did so much good to support incomes and to protect workers through the early part of the pandemic. And guess what? That spending wasn't quote unquote paid for. It didn't adhere to PAYGO. So it did add to the deficit. And it allowed Congress to move very quickly, because all they had to do was go around and collect the votes for the spending. They didn't also have to collect the votes for the tax increase.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Stephanie, I want to be really clear on this. Congress didn't have to go out and collect the tax dollars before they voted on the 2.2 trillion?
Yeah.
Say that again.
So there's this thing called the power of the purse, right? And Congress has it. Congress has the power of the purse. You and I don't. We can't commit to spending money that we don't have. If we could, you wouldn't see people lined up, you know, at food banks with miles long, you know, stretches of cars. You wouldn't see small businesses going under. You wouldn't see state and local governments pleading with Congress for aid. If we could all do what the federal government can do, hell, we would all just look after ourselves. But there's a difference between what Congress can do and what the rest of us can do. They have this thing called the power of the purse. They can commit to spending money that they do not have. And the reason that they can do that is because, as I said, Congress controls the purse strings, okay? So Congress can spend without the need to come up with the money from somewhere. That's what they did with the CARES Act. That's what the House tried to do with the HEROES Act. That's in fact what Congress is trying to do with these different bills, these bipartisan bills that are being put forward now. So those will add, I'll say modestly, to the deficit. My own argument is that we need to be doing much more, and I think everyone here tonight agrees with that. And PAYGO can very much stand in the way, because whereas, just committing the dollars and authorizing the spending it should be quite easy, right? Because it's the right thing to do, both economically and morally. Once you bring PAYGO in, you set up an extra hurdle, because now you've got to go around and convince other members of Congress to vote for your tax increase, to vote for your carve out of some other part of the budget. And it gets even more contentious and harder to pass legislation.
So I have two quick questions for you. One is, can the US government go bankrupt? And two, was there any discussion about PAYGO when we talked about the tax cuts 2 years ago?
Okay, well, the answer to your first question is no, categorically no. You see the picture over your shoulder on that book you held up, little Uncle Sam with his empty pant pockets, right? Notice the word right above Uncle Sam, myth. It's a myth. The idea that the federal government can run out of money, can go bankrupt, can go broke, can turn our nation insolvent. These things can't happen. Not to the United States of America, not to a currency issuing government like the US. So again, the government is different from the rest of us, and the key feature that makes the federal government different from state, local governments, businesses, households, is that they get to issue the currency and the rest of us just have to use it, right? We really do have to finance our spending. We are constrained. We face a financial constraint. The federal government is different. Your other question was, see, I've already forgotten. What was your question?
Somebody help me out. What was my other question, Darrick? Did we talk about the tax? Yeah, PAYGO during the tax cut?
Listen, PAYGO was waived off because Paul Ryan was in the House and he was he was majority leader in the House, and PAYGO got in the way of the Republican tax cuts. So Paul Ryan said, well, PAYGO is gone. We'll just waive it off. And so PAYGO did not stand in the way. Of course, Republicans tried to claim that the tax cuts would in fact pay for themselves because they were going to generate so much growth and so much new income that, taxes, revenues were going to come raining down on Washington. And that didn't happen and didn't matter in a sense, right? They just added to the deficit. Why? Because they're more interested in passing their agenda than anything else. And if they have to add to the deficit to get what they want, they're happy to do that. Democrats, I think, too often try to hold themselves to a different and they think higher standard. And that's what the problem can become, right? If you start saying, well, I'm not going to do what they do. I'm not going to add to the deficit to accomplish parts of my agenda. I'm more interested in deficit neutral, PAYGO stuff. That is going to absolutely kill the progressive agenda.
And that, okay. Sarah, if I could jump in real quick and just make this slight point in that's a critical point, that under the guise that this is all driven by economics, that a lot of this is politics, that only one side of the aisle actually pays any attention to it when it comes to a progressive agenda, and the other side of the aisle literally ignores it. Literally pays no attention to it when they want to pass a $2.1 trillion tax cut. So, that makes it politics. That makes it a political choice, values that are decided. In the case of war or military aggression, it's never part of the conversation. And whether you want to call that a national emergency or not, how could you not call this current pandemic a national emergency and even utter the words of austerity or some type of constraint when you got Americans, and I know other panelists are going to talk about this right now, insecure, hungry, literally hungry. If that's not in a national emergency, I really don't know what is.
Yeah, and I want to get to that. I just want to ask really quickly of you, Darrick and Stephanie, hasn't this pandemic, just with the $600 plus up alone, hasn't that turned on its head what you're talking about? So the Republicans were willing to throw PAYGO out the door when they were giving tax cuts to the rich to push the money up to the rich. But when they actually put money into the hands of people who otherwise didn't normally have it, didn't we find out that people were spending into the economy and that was actually improving the situation of the economy?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the key point that you're making. Every deficit is good for someone. We just have to realize that. Like, let's be honest, every deficit is good for someone. The Republican deficits that were passed in December of 2017, Republicans passed those tax cuts because they knew they were good for someone. Who were they good for? Well, 83% of the benefits went to the folks in the top 1% of the income distribution, and they had corporate income tax cuts as well. So in other words, the majority of the benefits, the windfall, if you like, went to the people who least need the help. When I say every deficit is good for someone, I mean that the government's deficit is just the difference between two numbers. One of the numbers is how many dollars they're spending into the economy, and the other number is how many they're subtracting back out, mostly by taxing. So a deficit means they're adding more in than they're subtracting away. And when they do that, well, somebody gets a surplus. The government's deficit is a financial contribution to some other part of our economy. Republicans like to send that financial contribution to people who least need the help. What happened in the CARES Act, Sara, you just said $600 extra a week, plus that $1,200 check. When people deposited that money, it went into their bank accounts, into their pockets. It made them financially better off than they would have otherwise been. So it's an example of using deficits to divert that surplus to the people who are hurting, who most need our help right now.
And if I can just brag on my people for a minute, the aviation payroll support kept people in their jobs. It was money that had to go directly to people's paychecks, keep us connected to our healthcare. And so the people that I represent were able to keep their jobs, continue to pay their rent, their utility bill, all of that, and pay their taxes. So they were continuing to contribute into society rather than being kicked out of their jobs and put onto unemployment insurance without healthcare. But Darrick, what were you going to say?
The biggest problem with the CARES Act is that it worked. The precedent that it sets, the demonstration that actually government can do this. The government can literally send direct checks to people with income. And that unveils that mythology that they can't. And the precedent of it being wildly successful also, sets the tone where we don't have to hold ourselves back from investing in our greatest resource, its people, whether we're in a pandemic or not.
So Brian and Reverend Coates, we've been talking sort of on a macro level here about how this is affecting real people. But, you have examples right from in your church, Reverend Coates, and in your community, and Brian, the reporting that you've been doing from the ground in Atlanta. And, what are people going through right now? And what do people need?
Reverend Coates, do you want to take that first?
Well, first, I'm really honored and delighted to be on tonight's conversation. And Sara, thanks for pulling this together. I think we're all here on such short notice because we are in a dire situation right now. In the county where I serve as pastor of church of almost 10,000 people, a county, Prince George's County, Maryland, that is regarded as one of the highest income earning counties for African Americans in the country. We see a great deal of food insecurity and economic insecurity. People literally feel that they are one paycheck away, 1 week away from missing a paycheck, from being kicked out of their home, having to foreclose, or not being able to pay their rent. Every week, our church, we're feeding thousands of people who you ought to see the lines of cars pulling up to our church every Tuesday and every Friday of every week for food. Food insecurity and economic insecurity are deep issues that we're facing in our country. And it is a true moral, it is a travesty that we are not appropriating, as Stephanie calls, the power of the public purse to address the needs of the American people. As we address the needs for stimulus right now, we have been working with people around policies that are really designed to get us out of the kind of one-off scenario where we have to, we do a stimulus and then we have to come back 4 or 5 months later, 3 or 4 months later. We have been organizing people around a federal job guarantee, and the reason we feel that a federal job guarantee is so critical and so important is that it's an automatic stabilizer for a population which ends up having double-digit unemployment whenever the national unemployment rate is at an acceptable level. We've got to have a federal job guarantee because it is not in the interest of the private sector to get us to full employment. We really need a full employment economy, and we need to harness and utilize the power of the public purse to address our greatest social and economic challenges today. And the kinds of issues that Stephanie and Darrick are talking about relative to PAYGO, these are not just academic conversations. Whenever the federal government is in deficit, the non-government sector is in surplus. People need money in their pockets. They need guaranteed income. They need guaranteed employment. And we're not talking about providing jobs to people who don't want to work. If there are when you factor in the people who are underemployed, people who have gone off of the unemployment rolls, people who are working 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet, we can solve these issues today, but we have to understand that the ability of the federal government to spend on these priorities is much greater than what we've been led to believe. The deficit myth is not just a myth, it's a lie. We have been lied to. We have been misled about the capacity of the federal government to create money for the things that we need. When we drop bullets and bombs on people of color around the world, members of Congress have no problem deficit spending. When we get tax cuts to the rich, no problems deficit spending. But when it comes to providing services and needs, healthcare, clean water, and guaranteed employment and jobs for our nation's most vulnerable, then all of a sudden it becomes financially irresponsible. And let me say this lastly, while many people whose political sensibilities tend to be left of center are putting all of their stakes on what happens in the Georgia Senate runoffs, we have to be equally concerned about the kind of fiscal policy framework that Democrats are operating from, because we see economic advisors of the president-elect saying things like, since we did the stimulus in March and April of 2020, now we kind of need to cut back on our spending. So some of our greatest political allies are articulating the kind of economic assumptions that are deeply against the very people who put them in office. And so that's why this panel discussion is so critically important.
And Reverend Coates, I think that's exactly it. People have to understand what they're fighting for. Do you mind, this is a big question, but hopefully we can sort of narrow it down, but do you mind giving people an idea of what a federal jobs guarantee would look like in your community? Because we're not talking about people who don't want to work here. We're talking about people who are ready and willing and able to work. What would that look like?
Well, a federal job guarantee is a federally funded legal guarantee to a dignified job with benefits for every American who wants one. It's federally funded and administered at the state and local level. There are a whole host of ways in which the federal government can responsibly spend, and it's important for us to say responsibly spend, to meet local and state priorities, to fix our roads and bridges, to address our environmental crisis. A federal job guarantee is a key part of the Green New Deal. The American Society of Civil Engineers says we need $4.6 trillion of infrastructure improvements all across the country. We can hire people right now in public sector jobs so that we can, right now, I have adults. I'm thinking of a couple right now. They're both driving for Uber. They are deteriorating their own vehicles to drive, Uber. They're trying to make ends meet, but they don't have benefits. They don't have the kind of economic security that they so desperately need. And for us, what better time to have a federal job guarantee than this year, when we had 15 to 30 million Americans who could not find employment. It's an automatic stabilizer. And the good thing about it is we would not have to worry about the needs of the American people being held hostage to the Mitch McConnells of the world or whoever is in power in Congress at that particular time. People need that kind of economic security today. And a federal job guarantee was so central to the civil rights movement in America, because it was felt that if we want to buffer some of the racial tension in America, we have to create an economy of opportunity where people do not feel as if their ability to provide for their families is jeopardized by opportunities given to other groups. So if we want to have any hope, in my mind, of buffering or helping to address the racial tensions in America, we need to address the deficits that matter, which are probably the most important sections in Stephanie's book. The deficits that matter are the deficit of healthcare, the deficits of jobs, the deficits as it comes to, having clean water. Those are the deficits that matter. And if we continue to force people to fight for scarce jobs and resources, we're going to continue to have these tensions in America today. And the good news is, and I'm a preacher, so I have to communicate the good news. The good news is that we have the resources, we have the capacity to responsibly create money to address these problems. If we change the way we think about money, we can literally change the world. That's the tagline for the Our Money campaign. Our website is ourmoneyus.org. If we change the way we think about money, we can literally change the world.
Yeah, I have in my mind right now people who are going through an apprenticeship to learn, how to build roads and bridges and buildings and green new buildings in the community, and then they bring those skills into the community and they keep them and they build it and they use it to build new schools. And then we hire the entertainers who are out of work right now, and they can be singing and keeping us joyful while we're going through this hard time. Anyway, you just painted a beautiful picture for me in my head, but let me go back to some of the pain a little bit here, because we got to define the problem and so what we have to fix. So Brian, do you want to share with us what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to emphasize, first of all, as many people have over the last several months, that there was a crisis, there was a catastrophe in this country before the pandemic started. I'm writing specifically about housing. And where housing is concerned, before the pandemic, there was not a single county in the US where someone working a minimum wage job could afford a median price 2-bedroom apartment in any county in America. So and that has less to do with there being a housing shortage, or an affordable housing shortage. It has to do with the commodification of housing, the commodification of people's homes, with the extraction of increasingly outrageous rents, because that's what a free market allows for. A laissez-faire approach to housing, which basically says that people are left to fend for themselves. And it's that disconnect between, poverty wages and what housing costs that led to a crisis before the pandemic even began. And so what my reporting is focusing on, what this book I'm writing is about, is really the rise of the working homeless. It's the rise in America of people who, as the Reverend was just mentioning, are working 2-3 jobs, and it's still not enough money to keep a roof over their family's head. These are people who are driving for DoorDash, they're driving for Lyft, and then at the end of the night, they and their kids are going to bed in that same vehicle. These are families, these are working parents who are getting off their shift at McDonald's at the Atlanta airport, as one of the families I'm writing about is, getting off their shift at the airport and then going to sleep in the atrium at that airport because they don't have a home to go back to. And so this is kind of the phenomenon that I was trying to document before the pandemic started. And my reporting here in Atlanta began about 4 or 5 months before the outbreak. And what this allowed me to do was really to track the 6 families that this book focuses on over the course of this totally devastating year, and to see up close the really acute consequences of what happened, when this $1,200 stimulus check ran out as quickly as it did, when the unemployment benefits, the extra unemployment benefits were cut off abruptly as they were. And one of the sites that I'm really focusing on, of course, as I'm sure many people are aware, there's a coming eviction tsunami catastrophe of just really unprecedented proportions. In nationwide, I believe the number is 30, 40 million renters at risk of eviction once the CDC eviction moratorium expires at the end of this month, really right after Christmas. Here in Georgia, that number is about 190,000 renter households that are at immediate risk of eviction once this moratorium expires. My reporting has actually focused on extended stay hotels where most of the working homeless families in America live. Either they're living in their cars, they're living very rarely in shelters. Sometimes they're doubled up, tripled up with other families. But a really vast number are living in these decrepit but actually quite expensive hotels. They've fallen into what's called the hotel trap because they might have an eviction already on their record. They can't get into another apartment. So what's really interesting and really harrowing about this site, about these hotels, is these hotels have not been covered by the CDC eviction moratorium, nor can the residents there receive rental assistance. So while I'm a huge advocate of extending the eviction moratorium, I'm a huge advocate of spending billions more dollars on rental assistance. What my sort of experience tracking with these families has shown me is the importance of just direct cash payments, that allowing people to just have money in their pockets, as we were just saying, gives them the freedom to stay even in this incredibly insecure housing environment, but at least it gives them a modicum of security. And that modicum has been stripped away systematically, intentionally. Something that I have been, and at this point it kind of feels like screaming into the void, but something I've been telling friends and people is like, when the millions of people who are going to be experiencing homelessness in the coming months are in that state, they will not have fallen into homelessness, as headlines often put it. They will have been violently, callously shoved into homelessness. They will have been violently and callously shoved into acute hunger, because this is a choice that we are making. And I think that I'm just sort of observing the most extreme edges of that emergency, of that crisis. But this is really something that, as the Reverend was talking about, even in his community, a relatively well-off community, is reverberating throughout every type of middle class and certainly working class household right now. So yeah, I can give specific examples of people who I have in mind, and it's really a matter at this point, I think, of running out of the words to describe how just utterly devastating it is. While our political class just fucks around with its gameplay. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. So I want to drill into a little bit about, who has been hit the hardest in this pandemic, and which communities have been hit the hardest, which workers have been hit the hardest, and and then also move from that sort of to what each of you thinks is the most important thing to have in this relief package moving forward. Hey, Darrick, we haven't heard from you for a little bit. Would you be willing to chime in?
Yeah, who is hit the hardest? Race is an intricate feature in our political economy. It has been, and it still is the case, that when, as Reverend Coates pointed out, when we have even acceptable, in quote, levels of unemployment, the Black rate is often twice that, and many times double digits. So when there is an economic downturn, it is usually the case that Blacks are the first fired and last hired. This pandemic was a little different. This pandemic, virtually everyone, we had widespread unemployment. So the first fired was almost pervasive. But as we see, even as the economy, I hate to use the word opens up, but even as we relax some of the hibernation to save people's lives, we see that the rate of absorption of the Black community into the economy is still slower. So, a program like a federal job guarantee would eliminate that altogether with a guaranteed right to employment. And I'm going to say a couple of things about the word entitlement, and then I'll stop talking. So we've been talking a lot about pay-go, but entitlement should not be a bad, dirty word. When we talk about political entitlement, when we talk about civil rights entitlement, that's acceptable. I think what we're all talking about here is a concept of economic entitlement, which has been demonized as a dirty word. And if we tie all this together in this conversation, as Reverend Coates pointed out, it is our money. And as Stephanie pointed out, we have capacities to fulfill entitlements. And it is, Sara, you thought of the name of this. It is immoral to allow what takes place by what Brian described to take place in this American society. So the concept of an entitlement to a home, the concept of an entitlement to a basic income, to a job, these are basic rights, economic rights, that without them, we condemn people to a life of despair, to not having authentic choice and agency in their lives. And the good news is that we really do have capacity. That this is not pie in the sky. We really can fulfill this. So here's the answer to the question of what I hope gets into the next package. There is no silver bullet. There's a recognition that there are various aspects of American life that should be entitled to people without question. And we can name them: the right to food, the right to healthcare, the right to housing, the right to a job, the right to a basic income. And then here's something that's very race relevant: the right to free mobility in society without the threat of bodily harm or detention because your identity is linked to some stigmatized group. These are basic rights that we really can afford and should instill in our American economy.
Thanks. So I want to know, what is it? What does this next package need to look like? Because it looks like maybe we're going to get a little something here this week, if we're lucky. And it's not what it should be. And it's really unfortunate. But we have to recognize, I have been saying to everyone, this is 4 months of emergency, lowest level down payment on what absolutely has to be necessary. And we're going to have to fight for what's really necessary in the new year. So if we're really going to fight for that, we have to be really clear about what we're fighting for and get everyone energized around that in order to create the political momentum to go forward. So what does that package need to look like to address the needs today and to address it with equity in mind?
One thing is people need income right now. So I think the debate over whether we should have direct payments to people, I think is a silly one. I think it worked last time, and clearly there should be income going directly to people. I think, and I know others will chime in as well. I think that extending, at least in the short run, unemployment insurance with the $600, that's another obvious one. I think people should not be rationed with regards to being able to go see a doctor in this time, especially if they lost their job and their health insurance was tied to their job. That's something else that we should put into the package. So we need to think about our public health in general. But I'm going to stop talking after I say this point. In addition to this package, we have to transition into automatic stabilizers as was presented by Reverend Coates. Otherwise, we will be vulnerable to the next crises that will come along from a despotic leader that's able to pit us against one another and able to attract all the votes that he was at, 70 million votes, with basically his signature policy being a tax cut to the wealthy and codifying the property rights and whiteness.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that, because I'm just going to add a little layer to this too as people are talking about this. But, you know, how do we build a package that actually begins to set a framework for a different way of approaching the economy going forward, an economy for the people? So can we actually build things in the near term, in the short term here, that can be a template for the kind of economy that we want to build going forward?
Well, look, I think that, you know, we sort of almost have buckets. We're working with some different buckets here, right? And we're still very much in the relief phase of this. And I know people use the word stimulus and that kind of thing, but, you know, if we're lucky, next year, Congress will come at this again, and we will start talking about recovery and some of the strategic investments that can be made to lay a sustainable foundation for an economic recovery. And if we were really lucky, we would use the other R word that FDR used, and we'd start talking about reform. And then we would get really into the sort of structural changes that we could make to the economy that would, you know, make our social safety net more resilient. Look, we know that this thing is not up to the job, right? It is not strong enough to support families, communities, businesses in an economic downturn, but we're not there yet. We're in the relief phase. And so you're saying, what do we need to have in this package? We need to have renewed unemployment insurance for people who remain unemployed. That absolutely has to happen, whether it's $600. I like 600. I'm happy to see 600 done again. Who knows what we might get, but that has to happen. And, you know, economists at the Economic Policy Institute have told us that just doing that will help to create or save 5.1 million jobs. We have an economy that is very much slowing down right now. So, you know, we've pulled our foot off the gas pedal. We've removed the fiscal support, and we're seeing the ramifications. The economy is slowing down. So what are we going to do? We're going to restore some income support for the unemployed. That's absolutely critical. But so is getting money to state and local governments. The same economists at the Economic Policy Institute tell us, if we do not provide, if Congress doesn't get money to state and local governments to help them avoid further layoffs, because they've already laid off 1.3 million people. If they don't get the money that they need to shore up their budget shortfalls and keep public services going and workers and so forth, we're going to lose millions more jobs. And guess what? Most of them are in the private sector, because public sector jobs support other jobs in the economy. So, I mean, you know, the stimulus checks or the direct cash payments, I think, are absolutely critical. We got to do something on rent. What are we going to do when we know that at the, you know, turn of the year, starting January, you're going to have about 12 million or so people who are behind on the rent, who will owe an average of almost $6,000. So even getting a $1,200 check or a couple of $1,200 checks and maybe some money for the kids, that's great. It's $3,400 for a family of four. But if you owe $6,000, you're still in trouble. You're still at risk of eviction. So we've got to do something on rent. It can't just be this deferring rent. It's got to be, you know, some cancellation. We've got to help people work their way out of debt, because the debt has been building up on folks. And I'll just throw in student loan debt as yet one more example, because, you know, all these people that were told, don't hang on to that money, don't pay back that student loan debt right now, just wait a minute. Well, it's all built up on them. So when the debts are coming due, it's the rent, it's the utilities, it's the student loan debt, and they're not going to have the income to do it. So we're going to be facing renewed carnage in this economy come January, February, March, if we don't get enough income support, and I think also do something to deal with the debt. The debts that are unpayable are going to bleed into the rest of the economy as defaults begin to happen.
So it's interesting that you brought up student loan debt, because that was one of the biggest questions that we got before we started tonight. And I just want to, I should have been doing this earlier, but if people who are watching right now have questions, tweet your questions with hashtag relief for the people. And we'll look for those and try to answer your questions over the next 20 minutes that we're here. But, you know, we want to really define the problem. We want to define the demands. And we also, I think everyone has been talking here about the fact that this is not hopeless. This is actually something that we can take on together if we define the problem, define the demands. There is urgency. So we know there's urgency. People are hurting, but we can come together and do something about it. So this is where we start, is really understanding it. So Reverend Coates, what would you like to see in the relief package that you think it makes the most sense? And then we'll get some questions too.
Yeah. Well, I think Darrick and Stephanie have really hit the nail on the head. We need all of these. We need people need money in their pockets, and they need $600 at least, and not the $300 that I've heard bandied about. We need the unemployment insurance, and we need assistance with rental or housing assistance. This is really a critical issue right now, because the stimulus, the package that's being put together is really 4 to 6 months behind. And so we need the broadest package possible. So I would say, the unemployment insurance, money in your pockets, assistance with rent or mortgage delinquency, and certainly school loans as well. So I think, Stephanie ticked off, the key, for elements with that. I would add a fourth R to her framework: relief, recovery, reform. But if I could draw on Bishop William Barber, we need revival. We need a moral revival, because we are in this situation because we have prioritized the special interest over the public interest. Mm-hmm. I think what is the greatest injustice about this conversation about harnessing the power of the public purse to address public interest priorities is that we use the public purse right now. We harness the power of the public purse to bail out banks, we have used the power of the public purse to bail out banks, to provide subsidies for commercial bank lending and loans. We use the power of the public purse for everything else. It is time now. And I think people see, and they saw in March and February, that the federal government created $3 trillion without taxing Jeff Bezos, without taxing Warren Buffett, without taxing Beyonce and Jay-Z or Oprah. And so if we could do that, we can do it again, and we can do it responsibly without exceeding the inflation target. And I think that we really have to have a conversation about changing our nomenclature, right? That we've got to talk about deficits differently. I don't even know what the solution to this is. But in my mind, deficit doesn't cost us. It doesn't cost money. It creates money. It's a surplus. We've got to start reframing this, because when people hear deficits, they tend to think negative. They tend to think the problem. Even trying to have conversations with public officials it's very difficult. And I've had, Stephanie, we've tried to come together to talk with members of our Maryland delegation. So we've got to figure out a new way to develop new language and nomenclature. I think Stephanie's really been on the cutting edge of developing the most accessible language for lay people. But we've got to change the way we're talking about this subject so that people can really begin to organize locally around the kind of issues that they desperately need today.
So Reverend Coates, I believe strongly in a moral revival. I believe strongly in the fact that fairness is not about pulling everyone down to the lowest standard, but fairness is about raising everyone up, right? I believe strongly in the fact that an injury to one is an injury to all as a union leader. And so oftentimes some of the questions that we hear out there, this is for you, this is for the whole group, is why would we cancel debt? I work to pay off my debt? What's in it for me if you're canceling someone else's debt? And so I do think sometimes we have to answer that question about what's in it for me, while we're also trying to reprogram on the moral revival of lifting everyone up. So I think that is one of the hangups that those with power and control will use to keep us divided, is why should we do something for that person that we didn't do for you? And so does anybody want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in. Following up on Reverend Coates about reconceptualizing framing, my discipline has captured the ways in which we define values as so entrenched into self-interested value that it's problematic. That if we start thinking about morality, humanity, dignity more broadly, then we'll be less vulnerable to being divisive amongst ourselves. It is a focus on self-interested accumulation that leads us to tribalism, that leads us to us versus them. So if we were to reconceive value, to think about humanistic values, to think about common well-being, and this ain't socialism or capitalism, this is just values, a belief in humanity. I think that would be transformative. And just to say a few things about student loan debt and the morality of it, the millennials came of age during the last Great Recession. We told them to go to college as the job market would progress, and they would get skills that would translate into economic returns. So they went to college, got record levels of debt, persisted in a long jobless recovery, a stagnated recovery where it certainly was not even in terms of how we recovered. And now they're faced with a global pandemic economic crisis now, where again, they have these record levels of debt and a double dip of scarring. And if we add a racial aspect of it, we know that amongst college students, Black students are more likely to have debt and have much larger sums of debt. 4 years after graduation, a typical Black graduate has $50,000 in debt. And by the way, this is not just about millennials. People in my generation are still paying off debt. You got people 50 years and over that are still paying off their college debt. That's a problem. That is I'm going to use a little hyperbole, a sharecropping model where their labor is being used to pay off interest rather than social mobility. And this clearly has racial implications, but not just racial implications. It is widespread. When we tell Black people that their pathway to social mobility is self-investments in education, and we have a good like education where the returns to a college degree are less for Blacks than it is for whites, no matter what domain we look at, whether it's wages, whether it's health, longevity, whether it's wealth. And not only is the return a lower amount, but that they have to pay more to get that degree, right? That's a problem. If we want to promote shared prosperity and get rid of some of the immorality that's associated with race, then we would put at a baseline in the 21st century a pathway to a college degree as a means in and of itself without the albatross of debt. And we have an opportunity now to engage in restorative justice by canceling that debt. As Stephanie pointed out, we're faced with a benefits cliff that's going to be traumatic. So one aspect of that benefits cliff that's going to come to fruition if we don't do anything about it is student loan debt.
And I'd like to add something. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I know I was going to ask you, Reverend Coates, actually, what would your parishioners say about that? Because a lot of people say this is going to benefit rich white people.
I would add to this, to what Darrick has stated, that when one understands the mechanics of modern money, from my perspective, the same mechanics involved in creating a Pell Grant, which was big in the early 90s when I was going to college, are the same mechanics of modern money that go into creating a loan. And so these are political decisions to either trap people and place economic burdens upon them that will endure for decades, or to facilitate a pathway to education and economic freedom that doesn't trap them in this way, right? The idea that people are being loaned money when they're really just giving digits and numbers into a computer. I mean, these are not, and so to me, I think that the same mechanics that went into creating this generation that is burdened by school loans are the same mechanics of money that went into extending Pell Grants to a prior generation and enabled them to get college education without being trapped by that same debt. This is not the burden and responsibility of individuals. This is not the responsibility of bad choices or irresponsible behavior of individuals and their parents. These are societal decisions. These are political decisions that got us into this mess. And those same choices and decisions can get out of this mess. For me, the most powerful phrase in the deficit myth is when Stephanie tells this anecdote about a congressional budget report, and one of the members of the budget committee asked her to write out 2.5 trillion with the commas and all of the zeros. And she's like, what's the difference between writing 2.5 T and writing it all the way out? And he said, well, it's a big number. And her response, I think, is the most salient part of the book. She says, it's just numbers. The reason the debt problem is so immoral is that they are just numbers. We are allowing our willingness to type numbers into a computer keep people in economic slavery and bondage for generations. That's it. And I think that is the deepest moral travesty as it relates to the debt question today.
And Stephanie, on a macro level, how does this individual debt hurt everyone in society?
All right, well, so you've got about 1.7 trillion that is owed by some 46 million people. And, you know, it affects different people in different ways. For some people, it's the reason that they can't get married and start a family. For other people, it's the reason they can't move out of their parents' home, get a place of their own. For other people, you know, it's holding back that car purchase, or it's the reason they don't go out to dinner more than once a week or take a vacation because, you know, all the disposable income has to go to service, you know, student loan debt or something. So at the macro level, it is like a wet blanket, right? It is, imagine the alternative. What would people do if they didn't have to pull out the checkbook every month and write that $300 check or that $700 check or that $1,200 check to service their student loan debt? What would they do instead? Well, you know, people would spend a whole lot more money into the economy. They'd be flying on airplanes. They'd be going out to restaurants. They'd be going to the theater. They would be buying that new pair of tennis shoes. They would be, you know, I mean, it's pretty.
The carbon neutral emission airplanes, by the way.
Carbon neutral. But look, I want to really quickly, I know we're running short on time, but this question about, hey, that's not fair. I paid off my student loan debt, so I'm opposed to, you know, debt cancellation for anybody today because by God, I had to suffer my way through repaying my student loans and so forth. This is, you know, I understand it on some level, but then on a very deep level, I really just don't get it because I want the generations that come after us to do better than we did. I want people to have an easier go of it. And plus, you know, all this student loan debt, this is a policy failure. That's why we have 1.7 trillion. But would you want to hear somebody say, I'm opposed to raising the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour because I retired yesterday and I was making $7.25 an hour. And I went through my whole working life at $7.25. So I'm opposed to moving the minimum wage up now because I didn't get it, right? I want the working class to have better conditions, to have better pay, to have better benefits. And so I want to fight for, you know, if I had paid for my health insurance all along and then somebody said, well, what about, you know, moving to single payer or something like that? I say, no, that's not fair. I paid for my private health insurance my whole working career. No, come on, let's create the world we want. Let's have the social safety net strengthened for workers to come, for future generations. Like, you know, some solidarity here would be nice, right? We're all members of the working population, we're working people, and we ought to want for other working people, I think, better pay, better working conditions, and we ought to be able to stand up and fight for someone we don't know, and somebody who may not, you know, is not ourselves. It's not about us, it's about all of us.
So I want to ask, we're going to go just a couple minutes over, but I want to ask, you know, Brian, can you see the face of someone who is affected by, you know, this personal debt and tell their story? Because I think that one of the other problems is that we have not been willing to talk about the people living in poverty in this country. And we have gone from, in, you know, the last 30 years, gone from under 20% poverty to almost 50% of the population is living in poverty now. And it's been about poverty shaming and telling people that they shouldn't talk about the fact that they can't pay their bills and they can't have a home and they should be ashamed of that. And so I think it's really important that we're telling their stories. And can you describe a face and tell us a story of someone that you've talked to that's coming to mind as we're talking about all this?
Yeah, sure. So, so Stephanie is I think she's 32 years old. She has 3 children, 3 boys. She was working as a medical receptionist, and because of a prior eviction, had been living in one of these extended stay hotels for about 2 years. When the pandemic started, the volume at this medical office drastically cut off, and she was laid off because she wasn't eligible for rental assistance in Atlanta. She was left to fend for herself. In order to even get this job as a medical receptionist, she's been putting herself through college at the same time, taking on massive debt at a for-profit online college. And it just got to the point where she was in having to decide, do I put gas in my car? Her kids couldn't go to school, obviously, so she had to find some form of work that allowed her to be with them during the day. Long story short, she ended up getting evicted from this hotel at gunpoint back in September. And after getting evicted from the hotel, along with about 15 other families, the hotel is co-owned, by the way, by the former Democratic governor of Georgia, Roy Barnes. There was a lot of organizing and protesting around this, but she was one of about 15 families that was evicted at gunpoint, and then went to go live in her car with her boys, and after that went to stay with another family in really overcrowded conditions, got COVID while staying with this family, and just a couple of weeks ago was hospitalized and almost had to go into ICU because she had some comorbidities. So, she is just an example. I mean, I hate to even have to like put this language on it that she's so hardworking, and because it reifies this distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor, which is so insidious, and that question of who is deserving and who isn't deserving has been, I believe, just poisonous in our discourse on poverty in America. That's what led to the decimation of the social safety net and the destruction of direct cash assistance in welfare reform under Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich. So I hate to even put that kind of language around her, that she's hardworking, but she is. She's an amazing woman. And there is absolutely no reason why she should have to have suffered in this way. She was part of this population of the working homeless before the pandemic began. But if you really want to see devastation, look at what happens when the working poor or the working homeless become the formerly working homeless or the formerly working poor. Then it really literally is a question of life and death. And a quote that has been going around in my head for the last few months is a cultural critic named Michael Denning. He said, under capitalism, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. And I think, you know, she was already working for poverty wages at, you know, these various jobs and struggling to survive. But you take away that unemployment insurance, you take away the direct cash payment, and there's just nothing there. And just really, really quick, because I don't want to end on this like utterly despairing note. I
won't let us.
Just to go back to what Reverend Coates was saying, what Darrick is saying, and what all of us have been saying about revival and about seeing in this moment a sense of possibility. You know, we would just be remiss to not acknowledge that that in this focus on essential workers, as cynical as that has become in many quarters, we are seeing the faces of people who have gone more or less neglected and invisibilized for the last several decades. And so issues are coming to the fore. We're talking about canceling rent. As Darrick pointed out, when people got these direct cash payments, it was like, wow, that can actually happen. And now we have a sense of possibility. We have a new president, and the prospect of just returning to normalcy, as so many people have been celebrating because the nightmare of Trump is ending, would be a continuation of a different kind of nightmare for an entire segment of our population. We can't return to normalcy. We have to seize this opportunity to think otherwise about what we can be as a country, and to reframe our language, and this idea of handouts, to look at the ways that the rich are getting, they're on welfare, they're getting these handouts, you know, so let's just give it to everybody. So I think that is really what I'm trying to hold on to, that amid this suffering, amid this devastation, something really is emerging. And I think that's incredibly exciting to be living in a moment of, yeah.
We have a shared experience that we can organize from, and we need to organize from here. And Stephanie said the other night, she said that I'm almost at a loss for words, except that I'm not completely out of them. And so I'm going to speak when we get together. And I think that we should get together more often, because we should be talking. There's so much here that we have to talk about to have people believe and understand what is possible. But Stephanie, I want to give you some space to say some of the things that you wanted to say the other night. And then Reverend Coates, I'm going to ask you to take us out with something uplifting and positive.
Well, I mean, I want to be uplifting and positive too. It's just that I'm so damn frustrated, and that's
call it out, girl.
That's really how this came about, because we three, Darrick and Sara and I, will get in these, you know, private chat conversations, and we'll be texting or whatever, and just you just have to, you want to shake someone, you want to scream, you want to let it out. You're so frustrated, and so I unleash on them, and we all unleash our, you know, our frustrations between ourselves. And I think I just at some point said we should say this out loud, and we should just go public and have a conversation. I think we were pretty restrained, to be honest, this evening. But, you know, it's frustrating. I teach economics, and I made a joke the other day that, you know, this is the question you put first on the exam, because you're trying to build the students' confidence. So you give them the easy questions first, right? What should we do now to support people in a pandemic and as the wheels come off the economy? That's the question you put first, because it's easy to answer, right? And yet we have Congress that's just completely sitting on its hands for months on end. We know that the bidding is going in the wrong direction. We started off with a $3.4 trillion opening salvo, right, from the Democrats. And then the number has just gradually come down over time, to the point that we keep talking skinnier and skinnier and skinnier. Everybody's starving, and the bill is getting skinnier and skinnier. So, you know, it's frustrating, because as we've been talking about for the last hour, you know, it's a pen stroke. It's the power of the purse. It's as simple as getting the legislation written correctly, include the kinds of things that ought to be in it, provide the income support, provide the fiscal support for this economy, and be prepared to continue to do it for as long as it takes, right? And recognize that we really could pick up the pieces as the economy has fallen apart. And you know, as Brian said, we don't want to pick up the pieces and put them back together the way they were assembled before, because that was not a good economy. We want to be able to pick the pieces up and put them together differently this time. Build back a stronger, more resilient economy that looks after people, cares for people. Let's create the world we know we could have. We have intersecting crises: healthcare, economic, housing, racial justice. It's climate. It's all bearing down on us. So why not take advantage of the opportunity? And as we've heard again and again, we have the capacity. So, you know, we can do these things. We just need some imagination and some bravery in Congress, somebody to step up, enough of them to step up and commit the kind of resources that will help us transform lives and livelihoods in this world into the kind of, you know, place that we all would be much happier living in, you know?
Amen.
Well, that was uplifting, Stephanie. So I'm gonna give you an A+ on that too. So. but quite seriously, Reverend Coates, you know, and Darrick and Stephanie and Brian, I think that we should get together again. So I think we should do this again. And
Yeah.
Yes, okay. But Reverend Coates, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, we definitely have to convene again. And Sara, I think I'll end where you started. You started talking about having a moral vision for our economy, for our society. And when I think about that, I think about Dr. King saying that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The thing about that is that it doesn't bend by itself. It doesn't bend on its own. We have to use our heads, our hands, and our hearts to bend this moral arc towards justice, peace, and sustainability. And I'm actually convinced when I think about it that many of our members in Congress, Stephanie, actually understand much of what we said. We have got to build a movement of people from the bottom: labor, citizens, lay people, faith leaders, who are putting pressure on our members of Congress to make the change that we need to see. And so I'm committed to doing that. I know that all of us on this Zoom today and those who are watching are committed to doing that. And I think that if we build that grassroots movement of people, we can have the kind of society that we envision. Thank you.
That's everybody out there watching tonight. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.